Cop dismisses missing girl's case, then breaks down when he finds her hidden journal. Chillicothe, Ohio, in March of 2025, was a town clinging to the remnants of its past glory. Once a thriving industrial hub, it had slowly succumbed to economic decline, leaving behind empty factories, boarded-up storefronts, and a sense of weary resignation among its residents. The Scioto River still flowed through the heart of town, but its waters seemed to mirror the town's own sluggish spirit. Officer Dan Wheeler, a 48-year-old widower, had spent his entire adult life policing the streets of Chillicothe. He knew every alleyway, every back road, every family with a history of trouble. He had seen the town change, seen the hope dwindle, seen the despair creep in. He had become, in many ways, a reflection of Chillicothe itself, weathered, worn down, and operating on a kind of autopilot. His wife, Mary, had died 5 years earlier from a sudden aneurysm, leaving a gaping hole in his life. They hadn't had children, and Dan had thrown himself into his work, using the routine and the structure of policing to numb the pain of his loss. He went through the motions, enforcing the law, responding to calls, but his heart wasn't in it. He had lost his spark, his sense of purpose. His days followed a predictable pattern. He would wake up before dawn, make a pot of coffee, and head to the small, understaffed police station on Main Street. He would check the overnight reports, mostly minor incidents, traffic violations, noise complaints, the occasional drunken brawl. He would then spend the morning patrolling the town, making his presence known, exchanging nods with the familiar faces he encountered. He would have coffee at the local diner, Rosie's, where he would exchange pleasantries with Rosie, the owner, and the regulars, mostly farmers and retired factory workers. He would listen to their complaints about the weather, the government, and the declining state of the town. He rarely offered his own opinions, content to let the conversation flow around him. He had become detached, cynical, and jaded. He had seen too much suffering, too much human misery, to believe in easy solutions or happy endings. He had learned to compartmentalize, to shut down his emotions, to focus on the task at hand and not get too involved. He was a cop, not a social worker, he often told himself. He enforced the law, he kept the peace, and he went home. His life had become a gray routine. He was existing, but not living. Mia Evans was a spark of creativity in the otherwise muted landscape of Chillicothe. A 15-year-old with a cascade of fiery red hair, usually pulled back in a messy braid, and eyes that shifted between a vibrant green and a stormy gray depending on her mood. She possessed an artistic talent that seemed out of place in her surroundings. She lived with her mother, Sarah, and her younger brother, Timmy, in a small, ramshackle house on the outskirts of town, a place that seemed to sag under the weight of unspoken anxieties. Sarah worked long hours as a waitress at a truck stop, often leaving Mia in charge of Timmy. Sarah was a low-lying mother, but she was also exhausted, overwhelmed, and increasingly reliant on alcohol to numb the pain of her dead-end life. Mia's biological father was long gone, a fleeting memory of a man who had promised the world and delivered only disappointment. In his place was Uncle Pete, Sarah's brother, a gruff, unemployed mechanic with a volatile temper and a history of run-ins with the law. Pete lived in a dilapidated trailer on the edge of the property, a constant source of unease for Mia. Mia found solace in her art. She would spend hours in her small, cluttered bedroom, sketching, drawing, and painting. She filled notebooks with images of fantastical creatures, vibrant landscapes, and portraits of people she imagined living lives far removed from the drab reality of Chillicothe. Her art was her escape, her refuge, a way to express the emotions she couldn't voice, the dreams she dared not speak aloud. She was a good student when she attended school. She had a natural curiosity and a quick mind, but her home life often interfered with her studies. She would miss school to care for Timmy, to clean the house, or to simply avoid the tense atmosphere that permeated their home whenever Pete was around. She had confided in a few close friends about her artistic aspiration, dreaming of escaping Chillicothe and attending art school in a big city, far away from the suffocating constraints of her current life. But those dreams seemed increasingly distant, increasingly unrealistic. She had learned to be quiet, to be invisible, to avoid drawing attention to herself. She had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of her home life, to anticipate Pete's moods, to deflect his anger, to protect her brother as best she could. But she was tired, so very tired. And she was starting to lose hope. She was starting to believe that her art was not enough to save her. She kept more and more to herself. The call about Mia Evans's disappearance came in on a Monday morning in late March. The air was still crisp with the lingering chill of winter, and a gray sky threatened rain. Officer Wheeler was at his desk, sipping his coffee and reviewing the weekend's incident reports, when the dispatcher, a woman named Betty, buzzed him. "Dan, I've got Sarah Evans on the line," Betty said. "She's reporting her daughter missing. Says she hasn't seen her since Friday." Dan sighed. Another missing teenager. Probably another runaway. He had little patience for these cases, which usually ended with the kid turning up a few days later, sheepish and unapologetic. "Put her through," he said, his tone weary. Sarah Evans's voice was frantic, bordering on hysterical. "My daughter Mia, she's gone. She didn't come home from school on Friday, and I haven't seen her since. I'm worried sick." "Calm down, ma'am," Dan said, his voice calm and professional. "Tell me everything you know." Sarah explained that Mia had left for school on Friday morning as usual, but she hadn't returned home. She had called the school, but they said Mia had been marked absent all day. She had called Mia's friends, but none of them had seen her. She had driven around town searching for her, but with no luck. "She's never done anything like this before," Sarah sobbed. "She's a good girl. She wouldn't just run off." Dan, however, was skeptical. He had heard this story many times before. Teenagers, especially girls, often ran away from home. Arguments with parents, boyfriend problems, the lure of freedom, the reasons were endless. And Mia Evans, he recalled, had a history of skipping school. He had seen her name on truancy reports several times in the past. "Ma'am, is it possible she's with friends?" he asked. "Maybe in Columbus." "Does she have a boyfriend?" "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice desperate. "I've called everyone I can think of. No one has seen her. And she wouldn't just leave Timmy, her little brother. She loves him." Dan made a note of that. The younger brother could be a factor, but he still suspected a runaway situation. "Okay, ma'am," he said. "I'll take a report. But I have to be honest with you. Teenagers run away all the time. Most of the time, they come back on their own. We'll put out a bolo bee on the lookout, but there's not much else we can do at this point." He took down the details: Mia's name, age, description, last known whereabouts. He asked about any identifying marks, any social media accounts, any possible destinations. He filled out the standard missing person report, his movements mechanical, his mind already moving on to other matters. He hung up the phone, feeling a twinge of sympathy for Sarah Evans, but mostly just annoyance at having to deal with another likely runaway. He filed the report, placed it in the pending tray, and went back to his coffee. He figured Mia would turn up in a few days, and the whole thing would blow over. He had more important things to worry about. He was wrong, terribly wrong. He completely underestimated the seriousness of the situation. The days following Mia's disappearance were strangely quiet in Chillicothe. Life went on as usual, the rhythms of the small town undisturbed by the absence of one teenage girl. The farmers went about their work, the factories churned out their products, the children attended school, and the adults went about their daily routines. There were a few whispers, a few concerned glances, but for the most part, Mia's disappearance was treated as a minor blip on the radar, a personal tragedy for the Evans family, but not something that affected the wider community. Officer Wheeler, despite his initial skepticism, did follow up on the missing person report. He made a few calls, checked with local hospitals and shelters, and put out a bulletin to neighboring police departments. But he didn't put much effort into the search. He was convinced that Mia was a runaway, and he didn't want to waste valuable resources chasing after a teenager who would likely turn up on her own. He did, however, feel a nagging unease, a subtle sense of guilt that he couldn't quite shake. He kept remembering the look on Sarah Evans's face, the desperation in her voice. He kept seeing Mia's name on the missing person report, staring up at him from his desk. He tried to push these feelings aside, to focus on his usual routine. He went to Rosie's diner for coffee every morning, exchanging small talk with the regulars. He patrolled the streets, enforcing traffic laws, responding to minor complaints. He tried to convince himself that he was doing his job, that he was doing everything he could. But the unease persisted. He found himself thinking about Mia more and more, wondering where she was, what she was doing, if she was safe. He started to question his own assumptions, his own biases. Had he been too quick to dismiss her as a runaway? Had he missed something important? He tried to rationalize his inaction. He was a small-town cop, with limited resources. He couldn't go chasing after every missing teenager who might have just run off with friends. He had to prioritize, to focus on the cases that were most likely to be serious. But deep down, he knew that he had made a mistake. He had let his cynicism, his jaded worldview, cloud his judgment. He had failed to protect a vulnerable child, and he was starting to feel the weight of that failure. It was a weight he had not felt since Mary had died. It was a weight he thought he had buried. It was a mistake he would never forget. 3 weeks after Mia's disappearance, on a chilly Monday morning, Timmy Evans walked into the Chillicothe police station. He was a small, skinny boy with wide, frightened eyes and a shock of unruly brown hair. He looked even younger than his 11 years, his clothes rumpled, his face pale and drawn. He clutched his backpack tightly, as if it contained all his worldly possessions. He approached the front desk hesitantly, looking up at Officer Wheeler, who was on duty. "Can I help you, son?" Dan asked, his tone gruff but not unkind. Timmy swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. I need to talk to someone about my sister," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "About Mia?" Dan's heart sank. He had almost forgotten about Mia Evans, the missing teenager he had dismissed as a runaway. He had been hoping she would turn up, that the whole thing would resolve itself without any further effort on his part. "Come with me," he said, leading Timmy to a small interview room. He offered him a chair and a glass of water, trying to put the boy at ease. "What is it, Timmy?" he asked gently. "What do you know about your sister?" Timmy looked down at his hands, twisting them nervously. He took a deep breath, then slowly reached into his backpack. He pulled out a worn, spiral-bound notebook, its cover decorated with faded drawings and stickers. "Mia, she gave me this," he said, his voice trembling. "She told me to keep it safe. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should give it to the police." Dan took the notebook, his hands suddenly feeling heavy. He recognized it as the kind of journal that teenagers often kept, a repository for their thoughts, their feelings, their secrets. He felt a surge of apprehension, a premonition that he was about to uncover something terrible. "When did she give you this?" he asked. "A few weeks ago," Timmy replied. Before she disappeared. Did she say anything else?" Timmy shook his head. Just to keep it safe. And to give it to the police if she didn't come back." Dan looked at the notebook, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that this was a turning point, that the contents of this journal could hold the key to Mia's disappearance and to his own redemption. He knew that he had to proceed carefully, that he had to listen to Timmy, and that he had to finally take this case seriously. He thanked Timmy and told him he would look after the book. He told Timmy to wait in the waiting room. Dan sat alone in the interview room, the worn journal lying on the table before him like a ticking time bomb. He hesitated for a moment, feeling a mixture of dread and anticipation. He knew that the words within these pages could change everything, could shatter his complacency and force him to confront the consequences of his inaction. He took a deep breath and opened the journal. The first few pages were filled with the typical musings of a teenage girl, doodles of hearts and flowers, notes about friends, crushes on boys, and dreams of becoming an artist. Mia's handwriting was neat and flowing, her drawings full of life and imagination. He saw sketches of animals, landscapes, and portraits of people she knew. He saw a self-portrait of Mia, her red hair cascading around her face, her eyes filled with a youthful exuberance. He saw a drawing of Timmy, his small face beaming with a gap-toothed grin. He felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss for the innocent girl who had created these images, the girl who had disappeared without a trace. He flipped through the pages, scanning the entries, searching for clues, for any hint of what might have happened to her. As he moved further into the journal, the tone of the entries began to change. The cheerful doodles were replaced by darker, more disturbing images. The handwriting became more erratic, the words more fragmented. He read about Mia's growing fear of her Uncle Pete, her descriptions of his increasingly erratic behavior, his anger, his drinking, and his inappropriate attention towards her. "He looks at me funny," she wrote in one entry, "like he's undressing me with his eyes. I hate it. I try to avoid him, but he's always there, lurking. Mom doesn't see it," she wrote in another entry. "She's too tired, too stressed. She doesn't want to see it. She says I'm imagining things." Then came the entries that made Dan's blood run cold. "He came into my room last night. While I was sleeping. He smelled of beer and cigarettes. He touched me. I told him to stop, but he wouldn't. I was so scared. I can't tell Mom. She wouldn't believe me. She'd say I was lying, trying to cause trouble. And Pete, he'd hurt me. He'd hurt Timmy. I don't know what to do. I feel so trapped. So alone. I wish I could just disappear." The final entry was the most chilling of all. "Uncle Pete waits till Mom's asleep. I can't breathe when he's here. If I'm gone, don't look for me. It's better this way." Dan closed the journal, his hands trembling. He felt a wave of nausea, a surge of anger and self-loathing. He had been so blind, so dismissive, so wrong. He had failed Mia in the most egregious way. He had ignored her silent cries for help, and now she was gone. He sat there for a long time, staring at the journal, letting the weight of his failure sink in. He thought of Mia, alone and terrified, enduring unimaginable horrors. He thought of Timmy, carrying the burden of his sister's secret, his small shoulders weighed down by guilt and fear. He thought of Sarah Evans, desperately searching for her daughter, clinging to the hope that she was still alive. He thought of his own wife, Mary, and how she would have reacted to this situation. She would have been outraged, heartbroken, and determined to find Mia, no matter the cost. He realized that he had allowed himself to become numb, to become detached from the human suffering around him. He had become a cog in a system, a bureaucrat in a uniform, rather than a protector, a servant of the people. He had to make things right. He had to find Mia, and he had to bring her abuser to justice. He had to redeem himself, not just as a cop, but as a human being. He stood up, his legs shaky, his resolve hardening. He grabbed the journal and walked out of the interview room, determined to do whatever it took to find Mia and bring her home. He owed it to her. He owed it to himself. Dan wasted no time. He gathered his small team, Officer Riley, Officer Chen, and two other officers, and briefed them on the contents of Mia's journal. He showed them the entries, the drawings, the chilling evidence of abuse. "We were wrong," he said, his voice filled with remorse. Mia Evans didn't run away. She was running from something, from someone, from her Uncle Pete. He outlined his plan. They would obtain a search warrant for the Evans property, focusing on Pete's trailer and any outbuildings. They would interview Sarah Evans again, this time with a more informed and sensitive approach. They would contact Child Protective Services and arrange for Timmy to be placed in protective custody. Officer Riley, who had initially shared Dan's skepticism about Mia's disappearance, was visibly shaken by the contents of the journal. "Damn it, Dan," he said. "We should have seen this. We should have done more." Officer Chen, who had suspected all along that something was amiss, placed a hand on Riley's shoulder. "It's not your fault, Davide," she said. "We were working with the information we had, but now we know the truth, and we're going to do something about it." Dan, fueled by a mixture of guilt, anger, and determination, contacted the local judge and obtained a search warrant. He explained the situation, presented Mia's journal as evidence, and emphasized the urgency of the matter. The judge, clearly disturbed by the contents of the journal, signed the warrant without hesitation. Dan then called Sarah Evans, asking her to come to the police station for further questioning. He was careful not to reveal the full extent of his suspicions, wanting to avoid alarming her unnecessarily. When Sarah arrived, she was distraught, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She had been clinging to the hope that Mia had simply run away and would eventually return home. But deep down, she had feared the worst. Dan, this time, treated her with compassion and respect. He apologized for his previous dismissive attitude and assured her that they were doing everything they could to find Mia. He gently questioned her about Pete, about his behavior, his relationship with Mia, and any history of violence. Sarah, initially hesitant, eventually opened up, revealing her own fears and suspicions about her brother. "He's always been a troubled man," she said, her voice trembling. "He's got a temper, and he drinks too much. I've tried to keep him away from the kids, but I didn't know. I didn't think he would." She broke down in tears, unable to finish the sentence. Dan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, offering her a tissue. "We're going to find Mia, Sarah," he said. "I promise you, we're going to find her." He then informed Sarah that they had obtained a search warrant for her property and that they would be focusing their attention on Pete. He explained that Timmy was safe and that he would be placed in the care of Child Protective Services. Sarah, overwhelmed with a mixture of relief, fear, and guilt, agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. She knew that her brother was capable of terrible things, and she prayed that Mia was still alive. She wanted her daughter back, but more importantly, she wanted her safe. The search of the Evans property was conducted with a sense of urgency and grim determination. Dan, leading the team, focused his attention on Pete's dilapidated trailer and the surrounding area. Pete was not present when they arrived. His truck was gone, and the trailer was unlocked. The interior of the trailer was even more squalid than the main house, a chaotic mess of dirty clothes, empty beer cans, and discarded tools. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and unwashed laundry. Dan felt a surge of disgust and anger as he surveyed the scene. This was the environment where Mia had been forced to live, the environment where she had been subjected to unimaginable abuse. They searched the trailer thoroughly, finding nothing that directly implicated Pete in Mia's disappearance. But the overall impression was one of depravity and neglect, confirming their suspicions about his character. As they were about to leave the trailer, Officer Chen noticed a small, wooden shed located behind the trailer, partially hidden by a cluster of overgrown bushes. The shed was secured with a heavy padlock. "What's in there?" she asked, pointing to the shed. Dan shrugged. "Probably just tools and junk," he said. "But we should check it out." He retrieved a pair of bolt cutters from the patrol car and approached the shed. He snapped the padlock and pulled open the door. The interior of the shed was dark and musty. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim, flickering light. As his eyes adjusted, Dan saw her. Mia was huddled in a corner, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around herself. She was bruised and trembling, her clothes torn and dirty. Her eyes were wide with fear, but also with a flicker of recognition. "Mia," Dan said, his voice choked with emotion. Mia looked up at him, her lower lip trembling. "Officer," she whispered. Dan rushed to her side, kneeling down and gently taking her hand. "It's okay, Mia," he said. "You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here." He felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by a surge of anger at the man who had done this to her. He wanted to find Pete, to confront him, to make him pay for his crimes. But his priority was Mia. He carefully helped her to her feet, supporting her as she stumbled out of the shed and into the sunlight. Mia blinked, shielding her eyes from the sudden brightness. She looked around, disoriented, as if she couldn't believe she was finally free. Officer Chen wrapped a blanket around Mia's shoulders, offering her a comforting smile. "You're safe now, honey," she said. "We're going to take care of you." As Dan looked around the inside of the shed more closely, he noticed art supplies, pencils, paints, and sketchbooks scattered amongst the dirt. It appeared Mia had tried to maintain some semblance of her normal, hopeful self, even in this dark place. Dan, overwhelmed with emotion, couldn't hold back the tears. He bent down and hugged Mia tightly, sobbing apologies for not believing her, for not seeing the truth, for failing to protect her. "I'm so sorry, Mia," he cried. "I'm so sorry." Mia, still trembling, clung to him, her small body shaking with sobs. She had been rescued, but the trauma she had endured would take a long time to heal. It was a moment of profound relief, but also of profound sadness. The immediate aftermath of Mia's rescue was a whirlwind of activity. Paramedics arrived at the scene, examining Mia and treating her injuries. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and covered in bruises, but thankfully, she had no life-threatening injuries. She was transported to the local hospital, where she was admitted for observation and further treatment. She was given food, water, and clean clothes. She was also examined by a child psychologist, who began the delicate process of assessing the extent of her emotional trauma. Pete was apprehended a few hours later, driving his truck on a rural highway outside of Chillicothe. He initially resisted arrest, but he was eventually subdued and taken into custody. He was charged with multiple counts of child abuse, kidnapping, and assault. He refused to speak to the police, demanding a lawyer. Dan, still reeling from the emotional impact of finding Mia, visited her at the hospital. He sat by her bedside, holding her hand, apologizing again for his failure to believe her. "I should have known," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I should have seen the signs. I'm so sorry I let you down." Mia, her eyes still filled with pain, but also with a glimmer of hope, offered him a weak smile. "It's okay," she said. "You found me. That's all that matters." Dan was deeply moved by her forgiveness, by her resilience, by her unwavering spirit. He knew that he would never forget her, and he vowed to do everything he could to help her heal and to rebuild her life. He also confessed his failure to Sarah Evans, who was at the hospital, understandably distraught but also immensely relieved that her daughter was alive. "I dismissed your concerns," he said, his voice filled with shame. "I assumed Mia was a runaway. I was wrong. I'm so sorry." Sarah, to his surprise, didn't lash out at him. She was angry, yes, but she also understood that he was human, that he had made a mistake. "I'm just glad she's alive," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for finding her." Dan knew that he had a long road ahead of him, both personally and professionally. He had to regain the trust of the community, the trust of his fellow officers, and most importantly, the trust of himself. He had to come to terms with his own failures, his own biases, and his own limitations. He had to learn from his mistakes and become a better cop, a better protector of the vulnerable. He also knew that he had a responsibility to Mia, to help her through the long and difficult process of recovery. He would be there for her, as a friend, as a mentor, as a protector, for as long as she needed him. He owed her that, and so much more. He would not fail her again. Mia's recovery was a gradual, painstaking process, marked by both progress and setbacks. She remained in the foster care of the Johnsons, who provided her with a stable, low-lying, and supportive environment. She continued to receive therapy, working through the trauma of her abuse and learning to cope with the emotional scars that remained. The legal proceedings against Pete were lengthy and complex. He initially pleaded not guilty, claiming that Mia was lying and that he had never harmed her. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Mia's testimony, the medical reports, the evidence found in the shed, and his own history of violence. Dan testified at the trial, recounting his initial misjudgment of the case, his subsequent investigation, and the discovery of Mia in the shed. He spoke with honesty and remorse, acknowledging his failure to protect her and expressing his deep regret for his actions. His testimony was crucial in securing a conviction. The jury, deeply moved by Mia's story and outraged by Pete's cruelty, found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to a long prison term, effectively ending his reign of terror. Throughout the trial, Dan remained a constant presence in Mia's life. He visited her regularly at the Johnsons' home, bringing her art supplies, books, and small gifts. He listened to her concerns, offered her encouragement, and helped her to navigate the complexities of the legal system. He also encouraged her to continue with her art, recognizing it as a vital outlet for her emotions and a pathway to healing. He arranged for her to take art classes at a local community center, and he proudly displayed her artwork in his office at the police station. Mia, initially hesitant and withdrawn, gradually began to open up to Dan. She saw in him not just a police officer, but a kind and compassionate man who genuinely cared about her well-being. She forgave him for his initial mistake, understanding that he had been blinded by his own biases and assumptions. She saw how much he had changed, how committed he was to making amends for his past failures. She saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, and she appreciated his unwavering support. Their relationship evolved into a unique and powerful bond, a testament to the healing power of forgiveness and the transformative potential of human connection. They were an unlikely pair, a jaded cop and a traumatized teenager, but they found in each other a source of strength, comfort, and hope. They both helped each other heal. The resolution of Mia's case had a profound and lasting impact on everyone involved. Pete's conviction brought a sense of justice and closure, but the scars of his abuse would remain with Mia for the rest of her life. However, Mia continued on her path of healing. With the help of consistent therapy, a stable home life with the Lovying Johnson family, who eventually adopted her, and new creative passions, she was able to move forward. She even reconciled with her mother, Sarah, who had completed a rehabilitation program and was working to rebuild her life. Sarah acknowledged her own failings and expressed her deep remorse for not protecting Mia. Their relationship was strained, but they were both committed to working through their issues and to building a healthier future. Dan Wheeler underwent a significant personal transformation. He retired from the police force a few years later, but he remained active in the Chillicothe community, volunteering his time to support at-risk youth and to advocate for child protection services. He became a mentor to young police officers, sharing his story and emphasizing the importance of empathy, compassion, and careful observation. He urged them to look beyond the surface, to listen to their instincts, and to never dismiss a child's cry for help. He also continued to support Mia, remaining a constant presence in her life, a friend, mentor, and a father figure. He attended her high school graduation, her art exhibitions, and her college graduation. Mia, against all odds, thrived. She graduated from college with a degree in art therapy, determined to use her own experiences to help other survivors of trauma. She became a passionate advocate for child abuse prevention, speaking at schools, conferences, and community events. She never forgot the horrors she had endured, but she refused to let them define her. She had transformed her pain into purpose, her victimhood into victory. She had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world. The story of Mia Evans and Dan Wheeler became a local legend in Chillicothe, a reminder of the importance of vigilance, the power of forgiveness, and the enduring hope for healing and redemption. It was a story that highlighted the dark underbelly of small-town life, but it was also a story that celebrated the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of human connection. It served as a constant reminder that, even if we are initially blind to injustice, there is always a chance to open our eyes and to start on a new, righteous path. It was a cautionary tale, but also a story of triumph,